July 5, 1943. Kursk Salient, Soviet Union, 0530 hours. General-Major Walter Hornlein stood in the cupola of his command half-track, watching through binoculars as Soviet forces repositioned along the defensive lines ahead. Among the familiar Soviet equipment, he noticed something that made him smile dismissively. Columns of American Studebaker trucks moving supplies, British Valentine tanks in reserve positions, and what appeared to be American jeeps shuttling officers between command posts. He keyed his radio with confident contempt. The Bolsheviks are so desperate they're begging for American scrap metal. A few thousand trucks and obsolete tanks won't save them from German steel and tactical superiority. This changes nothing. What Hornlein didn't know, what none of the 780,000 German soldiers preparing for Operation Citadel could have imagined, was that those few thousand trucks represented just a fraction of the most massive logistics operation in human history, an industrial tsunami that would fundamentally transform Soviet military capability from defensive desperation to offensive juggernaut. Within 18 months, American and British Lend-Lease aid would deliver 427,284 trucks, 13,303 combat vehicles, 2,670 locomotives, 11,155 railway cars, 15 million pairs of boots, and 4.5 million tons of food that would enable Soviet forces to conduct the deep operations that would destroy the Wehrmacht. The mathematics of Soviet salvation were already flowing through Arctic convoys and Persian corridors. Mobility that allowed operational maneuver, food that prevented starvation, locomotives that moved entire armies, and aluminum that built the aircraft dominating German skies. The transformation began that July morning when German intelligence's catastrophic failure to understand logistics met the reality that wars are won not just by weapons but by the industrial capacity to sustain armies across continental distances. German military intelligence, the Fremd Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, systematically underestimated Lend-Lease impact from the program's inception in 1941 through Germany's final collapse in 1945. This wasn't mere oversight, but fundamental misunderstanding of modern industrial warfare's logistical requirements. The German assessment, codified in numerous intelligence reports from 1942 to 1943, emphasized Soviet weapons production, tanks, aircraft, artillery, while dismissing Allied supply of non-combat equipment as strategically insignificant. A March 1943 Fremd Heere Ost assessment typified this blindness. Allied deliveries to the Soviet Union consist primarily of transport vehicles, locomotives, and raw materials. While these provide marginal assistance, they do not fundamentally alter the correlation of forces. Soviet military effectiveness remains dependent on indigenous weapons production, which our strategic bombing and territorial gains continued to degrade. This analysis was catastrophically wrong on multiple levels. First, it failed to understand that Soviet weapons production was possible only because Lend-Lease freed Soviet industry from producing supporting equipment. Second, it didn't grasp that operational mobility, enabled by trucks and locomotives, was as decisive as weapons themselves. Third, it underestimated the scale of Allied aid by factors of 10 or more. Oberst Reinhard Gehlen, commanding Fremd Heere Ost from April 1942, later admitted during post-war interrogation, "We knew the Americans were shipping supplies to the Soviets. We saw the trucks and equipment, but we fundamentally misunderstood the strategic significance. We thought in terms of weapons, tanks, and aircraft that we could destroy. We didn't think about the logistics infrastructure that allowed Soviet armies to operate at depths and tempos we couldn't match. By the time we understood, it was too late." The scale of German intelligence failure becomes clear when comparing estimated versus actual Lend-Lease deliveries. German intelligence in mid-1943 estimated Allied deliveries at approximately 50,000 trucks total. Actual deliveries by that date exceeded 150,000 trucks, with another 275,000 still to come. German estimates of aircraft deliveries were similarly off by factors of 3 to 5. More critically, German analysis completely missed how Lend-Lease freed Soviet industrial capacity. Every truck delivered from America meant Soviet factories didn't build trucks, they built tanks instead. Every ton of aluminum delivered meant Soviet aluminum production went to aircraft. Every locomotive delivered meant Soviet industry focused on weapons rather than transportation infrastructure. The Soviet Union's pre-Lend-Lease logistics situation was desperate, bordering on catastrophic. The German invasion of 1941 had overrun or destroyed vast swaths of Soviet industrial capacity. More critically, it had captured or destroyed much of the Soviet Union's transportation infrastructure. Locomotives, rolling stock, and the truck fleet that barely existed even before the war. Soviet truck production in 1941 totaled approximately 136,000 vehicles. German advances captured or destroyed an estimated 70% of this fleet. Soviet locomotive production was minimal. The USSR had relied on imported technology and pre-war manufacturing that was now in German hands. The result was an army that could fight defensively from prepared positions but lacked the mobility for operational maneuver. American Lend-Lease transformed this situation fundamentally. The Studebaker US-6 2.5-ton truck became the backbone of Soviet logistics. Between 1942 and 1945, America delivered 152,000 Studebakers to the USSR, more trucks than the Soviet Union manufactured domestically during the entire war. These weren't primitive vehicles, but sophisticated designs with all-wheel drive, high ground clearance, and robust construction ideal for Soviet road conditions, or a lack thereof. The operational impact was immediate and decisive. Soviet armies that had been tied to rail lines for supply could now operate 200 to 300 kilometers from railheads. This enabled the deep operations doctrine that Soviet military theorists had developed in the 1930s but lacked equipment to execute. Mechanized armies could penetrate German defenses, race into operational depths, and sustain themselves through truck-borne logistics. General Georgy Zhukov, commanding Soviet forces at multiple critical battles, later stated bluntly, "Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to transport our artillery with. Without Lend-Lease, we couldn't have moved our reserves or supplied our advancing armies. The Americans provided us with materiel without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war." The railway dimension was equally critical. The Soviet railway system, vital for moving armies across continental distances, was collapsing under wartime strain. Locomotives wore out faster than Soviet industry could replace them. Rolling stock was destroyed by German action or broke down from overuse. American and British Lend-Lease delivered 2,670 locomotives and 11,155 railway cars. These weren't marginal additions, but transformative infusions allowing the Soviet railway system to function. The locomotives were modern, efficient designs superior to most Soviet-built equivalents. They arrived fully assembled and operational, entering service immediately. The operational impact showed in Soviet offensive operations from 1943 onward. Operation Bagration in summer 1944, the destruction of German Army Group Center, was possible only because Soviet forces could move entire armies hundreds of kilometers, concentrate forces at breakthrough points, and sustain offensives for weeks without pause. This operational capability derived directly from Lend-Lease trucks and locomotives providing the logistics infrastructure. An often overlooked dimension of Lend-Lease was food. The German invasion had overrun the USSR's most productive agricultural regions, Ukraine and southern Russia. Soviet food production collapsed, creating the specter of mass starvation that would cripple the war effort as surely as lack of weapons. American Lend-Lease food deliveries totaled 4.5 million tons, including 2.6 million tons of grain, 663,000 tons of refined sugar, 782,000 tons of vegetable oil, 480,000 tons of canned meat, hundreds of thousands of tons of other foodstuffs. These deliveries prevented widespread famine in Soviet cities and industrial centers. More importantly for military operations, they fed the Red Army. A Soviet soldier's daily ration of 800 grams of bread, the foundation of the field diet, was often baked from American grain. The canned meat, derisively nicknamed Second Front by Soviet soldiers awaiting the Allied invasion of France, nonetheless provided protein that domestic production couldn't supply. The strategic calculation was brutal but clear. Every ton of American food allowed Soviet agricultural resources and labor to focus on military production rather than preventing starvation. Soviet collective farms already devastated by war couldn't feed both the army and industrial workers. Lend-Lease food made it unnecessary to choose. Nikita Khrushchev, wartime political commissar and later Soviet leader, acknowledged the significance decades later. If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. One-on-one against Hitler's Germany, we would not have withstood its onslaught and would have lost the war. No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never acknowledged it, but I would be ungrateful if I denied the role of American assistance. The food dimension revealed itself in German intelligence reports only gradually. By late 1943, German officers noted that captured Soviet rations increasingly contained American canned goods. By 1944, it was standard. The implications were clear, but their significance was misunderstood. German analysts saw it as Soviet weakness requiring foreign support, not recognizing it as strategic strength enabling the USSR to focus industrial capacity on weapons production.
Soviet aviation operations depended critically on high-octane aviation fuel that Soviet refineries couldn't produce in sufficient quantities. Soviet aircraft engines required 100-octane fuel for optimal performance, but Soviet refineries in 1941–1942 produced primarily lower grades unsuitable for high-performance engines. The bottleneck wasn't refining capacity per se, but the specialized catalytic cracking equipment and expertise required for high-octane production. This was a technology the USSR hadn't fully mastered before the war, and wartime disruption made developing it impossible. American Lend-Lease delivered 2.7 million tons of aviation fuel, primarily high-octane gasoline, to the Soviet Union. This represented approximately 37% of Soviet aviation fuel consumption during the war years. But the percentage understates the strategic impact because the American fuel was consistently high quality, while Soviet production varied widely. Soviet fighter and bomber operations depended on this fuel. The Yakovlev Yak-3 and Lavochkin Law-7 fighters, among the best of the war, required high-octane fuel to achieve their performance specifications. Strategic bomber operations were possible only with consistent fuel quality that Soviet refineries couldn't guarantee. The aluminum situation was equally critical and even less visible to German intelligence. Soviet aluminum production, essential for aircraft manufacturing, was severely limited by loss of production facilities to German advances and lack of bauxite resources in accessible territories. American Lend-Lease aluminum deliveries totaled 328,000 tons, nearly two-thirds of Soviet aluminum consumption during the war years. This wasn't supplemental material, but foundational to the Soviet aviation industry. Without it, Soviet aircraft production would have collapsed or required fundamental redesigns using heavier steel construction that would have degraded performance catastrophically. The strategic insight is profound. The Soviet aviation industry that produced 157,000 aircraft during the war was possible only because American aluminum provided the raw material. German intelligence, focused on counting aircraft, never understood that those aircraft existed because American smelters worked around the clock, producing the aluminum Soviet factories assembled into fighters and bombers. While Lend-Lease is often associated with logistics equipment, significant combat vehicles were also delivered. These played complex roles, sometimes critical, sometimes supplemental, but always part of the larger picture of Allied material support. American tank deliveries totaled 7,537 units, primarily M4 Shermans and M3 Lees. British tank deliveries added 5,766 vehicles, including Valentine, Matilda, and Churchill tanks. Combined, these 13,303 tanks represented approximately 12% of total Soviet tank strength during the war. The percentage suggests these tanks were supplemental rather than decisive. The USSR built over 100,000 tanks domestically. But this misses their strategic significance at critical moments. During 1942 to 1943, when Soviet tank production was recovering from industrial evacuation, Lend-Lease tanks equipped entire units that would otherwise have been tankless. The British Valentine tank, delivered in quantities exceeding 3,000 units, served extensively on the Eastern Front. While inferior to late-war Soviet designs like the T-34-85, Valentines were reliable, available immediately, and freed Soviet production for other priorities. Soviet crews initially disliked them, cramped, undergunned by Soviet standards, but came to appreciate their mechanical reliability. Aircraft deliveries totaled 18,297 units, including 4,952 P-39 Airacobras, 2,908 P-40 Warhawks, 2,397 P-63 King Cobras, and 3,004 Hurricane fighters, various bombers and other types. The P-39 Airacobra became particularly significant in Soviet service. American pilots considered it inadequate for European combat due to poor high-altitude performance. But Soviet tactics emphasized low-altitude operations where the P-39 excelled. Its 37mm nose cannon was devastating against ground targets. Soviet pilots achieved high success rates flying Airacobras. Multiple aces scored their victories exclusively in this American fighter. Alexander Pokrishkin, second highest scoring Soviet ace with 59 victories, flew P-39s almost exclusively. His assessment: the Airacobra was the best fighter in the Soviet Air Force. In capable hands, it was superior to any German fighter at altitudes below 4,000 meters where most combat occurred. The Americans didn't understand how to use it. We did.
By late 1943, German officers on the Eastern Front began recognizing that Soviet capabilities were transforming in ways that weapons counts couldn't explain. Soviet armies were moving faster, sustaining offensives longer, and conducting operations at depths that should have been impossible given their supposed logistics limitations. Intelligence reports from the front reflected this growing awareness. An October 1943 report from Army Group Center noted, "Enemy mobility has increased significantly compared to previous year. Soviet mechanized formations demonstrate ability to operate 200+ kilometers from rail lines and sustain operations for extended periods. This suggests improvement in logistics capabilities that intelligence assessments have not adequately captured." A December 1943 Fremde Ost assessment began acknowledging the scale of Allied aid, though still underestimating its impact. Allied material deliveries to the Soviet Union exceed previous estimates. American trucks now constitute a significant proportion of Soviet logistics capacity. However, Soviet offensive capability remains dependent primarily on indigenous production. Captured Soviet soldiers, interrogated about equipment and supplies, increasingly revealed the extent of Lend-Lease integration into Red Army operations. Diaries and documents captured from Soviet units showed American and British equipment as standard rather than exceptional. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Forces, noted in his memoirs the changed Soviet operational capabilities. By 1943, Soviet mechanized forces were conducting operations that would have been impossible in 1941-1942. Their logistics sustainment and operational mobility exceeded anything we anticipated. This transformation wasn't just about more tanks, it was about the entire system supporting those tanks operating at tempos we couldn't match. The growing German recognition led to intensified efforts to interdict Allied supply routes. Submarine attacks on Arctic convoys, air raids on Persian corridor routes, and diplomatic pressure on Turkey to close supply routes all reflected German understanding that stopping Lend-Lease was strategically vital. But these interdiction efforts failed to materially reduce Allied deliveries. The Arctic convoy route, while dangerous, delivered 4 million tons of supplies. The Persian corridor, often overlooked, delivered 5 million tons. The Pacific route contributed another 8 million tons. The total delivery of 17.5 million tons of supplies overwhelmed German interdiction capabilities. The full strategic impact of Lend-Lease appeared in Soviet offensive operations from 1943 onward. Operation Bagration in summer 1944 exemplified how Allied material support enabled Soviet operational art to achieve its theoretical potential. Bagration destroyed German Army Group Center, eliminating 28 divisions and killing or capturing 400,000 German soldiers in 6 weeks. The operation's success derived from Soviet ability to concentrate overwhelming forces at breakthrough points, requiring rail transport moving entire armies, penetrate German defenses and race into operational depths, requiring trucks supplying advancing spearheads, sustain offensive tempo for weeks without operational pauses, requiring continuous logistics flow, and conduct multiple simultaneous operations across a 600-kilometer front, requiring surplus capacity. Every one of these capabilities derived partially or substantially from Lend-Lease equipment. The locomotives and railway cars moved the armies to concentration areas. The trucks sustained the advancing mechanized forces. The food fed the troops. The aviation fuel powered the aircraft, providing air support. The communications equipment coordinated the complex multi-army operation. German forces attempting to respond found themselves systematically outmaneuvered by Soviet forces operating at tempos German logistics couldn't match. German accounts from Bagration consistently note Soviet operational mobility as a decisive factor. The ability of Soviet mechanized forces to appear suddenly at unexpected locations, penetrate rapidly, and sustain operations despite German attempts at containment. Generalleutnant Hans Jordan, whose 9th Army Corps was destroyed during Bagration, wrote bitterly about Soviet capabilities. The Bolsheviks moved and sustained armies with an efficiency we couldn't approach. Their logistics capacity exceeded ours despite our technological sophistication. We later learned much of their transport was American. This explained their operational mobility. They were conducting mechanized warfare using American trucks, while we increasingly relied on horses. The material disparity decided the campaign before the first shot was fired. Beyond trucks and locomotives, an often invisible dimension of Lend-Lease proved tactically decisive: communications equipment. The Soviet electronics industry, primitive by Western standards even before the war, couldn't produce the radios, field telephones, and wire necessary for modern combined arms operations. American Lend-Lease delivered 380,135 field telephones and 956,000 miles of telephone wire. These weren't luxury items, but the nervous system enabling Soviet armies to coordinate complex operations. German forces, with their sophisticated communications equipment, discovered to their shock that Soviet command and control capabilities were improving dramatically. The contrast with earlier Soviet operations was stark. During the Winter War against Finland in 1939–1940, Soviet communications were so poor that division commanders sometimes couldn't contact their own regiments. Attacks were coordinated by prearranged timetables that fell apart when reality diverged from plans. By 1944, Soviet armies conducted intricate multi-corps operations requiring real-time coordination that was impossible without functioning communications infrastructure.
The radios themselves transformed tactical operations. American SCR-274N and SCR-284 radio sets equipped Soviet tank battalions and motorized infantry formations. British No. 19 wireless sets served similar functions. These allowed company and battalion commanders to coordinate maneuvers in real time, adjusting to battlefield conditions rather than executing rigid plans. Tank operations particularly benefited. Early war Soviet tanks typically lacked radios. Only battalion commanders had them. This meant tank companies advanced without internal communication, unable to coordinate or respond to threats. By 1943-44, Lend-Lease radios equipped increasing numbers of Soviet tanks, allowing the fluid tactical operations that German forces found increasingly difficult to counter. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, serving as chief of staff to multiple panzer armies, noted the transformation in his post-war analysis. Soviet command and control improved dramatically from 1943 onward. Their ability to coordinate complex operations, adjust to changing situations, and maintain communications across extended frontages exceeded what we thought possible for the Red Army. We later learned much of their communications equipment was Western supplied. This explained their operational sophistication that seemed inconsistent with previous Soviet performance.
The least visible, but perhaps most critical, Lend-Lease contribution came in industrial chemicals and raw materials. Soviet industry, even before the war, depended on imports for many specialized materials. The German invasion severed these supply lines and overran domestic production facilities. American deliveries included 842,000 tons of various chemicals, 345,735 tons of explosives, 127,000 tons of gunpowder, specialized alloys and rare metals, industrial diamonds for precision manufacturing, machine tools and industrial equipment. The explosives and propellants were particularly significant. Soviet ammunition production required vast quantities of nitrocellulose, TNT, and other explosives. Domestic production couldn't meet wartime demands, especially after loss of industrial regions to German occupation. American explosive deliveries, 345,735 tons, represented approximately 40% of Soviet explosive consumption during the war years. Without these deliveries, Soviet ammunition production would have faced critical shortages that would have limited artillery operations and reduced overall firepower. The strategic calculus was subtle but decisive. Soviet factories could produce artillery pieces and ammunition cases, but filling those cases with explosives required chemicals they couldn't manufacture in sufficient quantities. American chemicals kept Soviet ammunition factories operating at capacity. Machine tools enabled Soviet industry to maintain production despite catastrophic losses during evacuation and German advances. The USSR evacuated approximately 1,500 factories eastward in late 1941, a logistical achievement of staggering scale. But the evacuation damaged or destroyed much equipment. Lend-Lease machine tools, metal lathes, presses, precision instruments allowed factories to resume production in their new locations. The industrial diamonds and specialized tooling enabled precision manufacturing that Soviet industry couldn't achieve domestically. Aircraft engines, for example, required precision machine components that demanded specialized equipment. Tank transmissions needed hardened gears manufactured to tight tolerances. These required tools that Soviet industry lacked and couldn't produce quickly enough. The humanitarian dimension of Lend-Lease, while secondary to military considerations, nonetheless affected Soviet military capability. A sick or wounded soldier is as absent from combat as a dead one. Keeping soldiers healthy and returning wounded personnel to duty maintained Soviet combat strength. American medical supplies included 15 million pairs of leather boots, 106,893 tons of cotton, 54 million yards of woolen fabric, millions of doses of antibiotics and medicines, surgical equipment and field hospitals, blood plasma and medical supplies. The boots were particularly significant. Soviet boot production couldn't meet military requirements, and poor footwear caused massive non-combat casualties from frostbite and foot diseases. German accounts consistently note that Soviet prisoners captured in 1941-1942 often wore inadequate footwear, rags wrapped around feet, makeshift shoes, or civilian boots unsuitable for military use. By 1943-1944, American leather boots were standard issue for Soviet infantry. This seemingly mundane item had strategic impact, reducing non-combat casualties, maintaining soldier morale, and enabling winter operations that would have been impossible with inadequate footwear. The antibiotics, particularly penicillin, represented technology the Soviet Union couldn't produce domestically. Penicillin production required sophisticated fermentation technology and pharmaceutical manufacturing capability beyond Soviet capacity. American and British penicillin deliveries treated infections that would otherwise have killed or permanently disabled soldiers. Soviet medical personnel later acknowledged that Lend-Lease medical supplies reduced mortality rates and returned wounded soldiers to duty faster than domestic supplies alone would have achieved. The cumulative effect, thousands of soldiers who would have died or been permanently disabled, instead returning to combat, added divisions' worth of combat power across the war. By 1944, German strategic assessments increasingly focused on Soviet logistics capabilities enabled by Lend-Lease. The growing recognition that cutting these supply lines might be Germany's only hope of avoiding defeat led to intensified but ultimately futile interdiction efforts. The Arctic convoy route to Murmansk became a major focus. German naval forces, submarines, surface raiders, and aircraft attacked these convoys with determination bordering on desperation. The statistics were brutal. Of approximately 1,400 ships in Arctic convoys, 85 were sunk by German action. But the losses were strategically insignificant. The 85 ships sunk represented roughly 6% of total convoy traffic. The remaining 94% delivered their cargo successfully. Moreover, every German submarine, aircraft, or surface ship committed to convoy interdiction was unavailable for other missions. The resource allocation increasingly favored the Allies. Germany expended disproportionate effort for minimal return. The Persian corridor presented different challenges. Supplies landed at Iranian ports traveled by truck and rail through Iran to Soviet territory, a route German forces couldn't attack directly. German attempts to pressure Turkey into closing the route failed. Diplomatic efforts to sabotage the route through espionage achieved minimal results. The Pacific route was completely beyond German interdiction capability. Japan, Germany's nominal ally, maintained neutrality with the Soviet Union until August 1945. Soviet ships freely transported American supplies from Pacific ports through waters Japan controlled but didn't threaten due to the Neutrality Pact. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding German naval forces, expressed the frustration in a February 1944 assessment. Our efforts to interdict Allied supplies to the Soviets achieved tactical successes but strategic irrelevance. For every ship we sink, 10 reach ports safely. The Americans build merchantmen faster than we can sink them. The material flowing to the Soviets fundamentally alters the Eastern Front's strategic balance, yet we lack capability to stop it.
The cumulative effect of Lend-Lease appeared most dramatically in the Soviet offensives of 1944 to 1945. These operations, Bagration in Belarusia, Lvov-Sandomierz in Ukraine, Jassy-Kishinev in Romania, Vistula-Oder in Poland, and finally Berlin, showcased military capability impossible without Western material support. Operation Bagration, previously mentioned, destroyed Army Group Center in 6 weeks. The follow-on Lvov-Sandomierz operation in July-August 1944 destroyed significant portions of Army Group North Ukraine. These weren't isolated victories, but sustained operational tempo that allowed no recovery time between offensives. German forces attempting to respond discovered they couldn't match Soviet operational mobility. German units traveled increasingly by foot or horse-drawn transport as fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns immobilized vehicles. Soviet mechanized forces, transported by American trucks, supplied by American locomotives, moved at speeds German forces couldn't match. The Vistula-Oder operation in January 1945 exemplified Soviet operational art at its apex. Soviet forces advanced 300 miles in 3 weeks, from the Vistula River to within 40 miles of Berlin. This required moving entire armies across Polish roads in winter, sustaining them continuously and maintaining offensive momentum despite German resistance. The operation was possible only because Studebaker trucks carried supplies forward as fast as units advanced. American locomotives moved replacement personnel and equipment to keep divisions at strength. American food fed the troops during continuous operations. American fuel powered vehicles and aircraft providing support. American communications equipment coordinated the multi-army operation. German accounts from this period uniformly note Soviet logistical superiority as the decisive factor. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, analyzing the Vistula-Oder operation, concluded the Soviets moved armies at speeds we thought impossible. Their logistics sustainment matched their operational tempo. We couldn't respond effectively because we lacked the mobility and supply capacity to conduct sustained operations. They advanced while we retreated, both sides' capabilities determined by logistics capacity we couldn't match. By war's end, German officers who had initially dismissed Lend-Lease as strategically insignificant were forced to acknowledge its decisive impact. Post-war interrogations, memoirs, and military analyses consistently identified Allied material support to the USSR as a critical factor in Soviet victory. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, in his memoir, Panzerleader, acknowledged, "The Soviet armies we faced in 1944 to 1945 bore little resemblance to those of 1941 to 1942. Their material superiority was overwhelming. Much of this derived from American supplies, trucks, locomotives, food, and raw materials. The Americans didn't just send weapons, they exported their industrial capacity, enabling the Soviets to conduct operations at scales we couldn't match." General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's most capable field commander, reached similar conclusions. Soviet operational capabilities improved dramatically from 1943 onward. This wasn't just learning from experience or improved training. Their logistics capacity, the foundation of sustained operations, exceeded anything their domestic industry could have provided. Western supplies, particularly American trucks and locomotives, fundamentally altered what Soviet armies could achieve operationally. The most damning admission came from German intelligence itself. A post-war U.S. Army interrogation of Friedrich Heer Ost staff revealed the catastrophic assessment failure. "We underestimated Lend-Lease's impact by entire orders of magnitude. We thought in terms of weapons that we could destroy. We missed that American supplies enabled the entire Soviet war machine to function at levels impossible with domestic production alone. By the time we understood this, late 1943 at earliest, the strategic situation was irreversible." Soviet authorities during the war minimized Lend-Lease's significance for propaganda purposes. Stalin rarely acknowledged Allied aid publicly, preferring to emphasize Soviet heroism and sacrifice. The official Soviet narrative portrayed the USSR as defeating Germany through its own strength. But privately, and in post-war acknowledgments, Soviet leaders admitted Lend-Lease's critical importance. Marshal Zhukov's statement, previously quoted, represented the private consensus among Soviet military leadership. Nikita Khrushchev's acknowledgement similarly revealed what couldn't be said during Stalin's lifetime. Perhaps most tellingly, Soviet logistics officers, the men who actually managed the supply system, uniformly acknowledged dependence on American equipment. General Andrei Krylev, responsible for Soviet rear services, or logistics, throughout the war, stated in internal reports that American trucks were the backbone of Soviet supply operations, and their loss would have crippled offensive capabilities. Soviet rail officials similarly acknowledged that American locomotives prevented the railway system's collapse. The 2,670 locomotives delivered represented roughly 15% of Soviet operational locomotive strength at any given time, but these were the most reliable locomotives, performing disproportionate work relative to their numbers. Soviet aviation fuel specialists admitted that without American high-octane fuel, Soviet fighter performance would have degraded significantly. The aviation industry acknowledged that without American aluminum, aircraft production would have required fundamental redesigns using heavier materials. The cumulative Soviet acknowledgement, while often private rather than public, was clear. Lend-Lease provided the logistics infrastructure, raw materials, and industrial capacity that enabled the Soviet Union to focus domestic production on weapons, while American production handled the supporting requirements.
The question historians debate: could the Soviet Union have defeated Germany without Lend-Lease? The answer is complex and depends on assumptions about alternative scenarios. Without Lend-Lease, Soviet industry would have faced impossible choices: produce trucks or tanks, build locomotives or aircraft, manufacture aluminum, or accept reduced aviation production. Every truck produced meant one fewer tank. Every locomotive meant delayed weapons production. The likely result would have been Soviet armies with adequate weapons but inadequate mobility and logistics. They could have defended, but conducting the sustained offensive operations that destroyed the Wehrmacht would have been impossible, or at least severely delayed. Germany would have faced a stalemate on the Eastern Front, unable to defeat the USSR, but facing Soviet forces incapable of the deep operations that actually won the war. This might have resulted in negotiated peace, prolonged conflict, or eventually Soviet victory, but at far higher cost and on far longer timeline. The consensus among military historians is that the Soviet Union would likely have survived German invasion even without Lend-Lease. The invasion's failure was apparent by December 1941, before Lend-Lease deliveries reached significant scale. But Soviet ability to transition from survival to victory, from defense to crushing offense, depended critically on Allied material support.